Good morning, good afternoon, good day, and greetings, salutations with a side of welcome to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. My name is Tristan Watty, and I am joined by the mysterious, the marvelous, the myth, the man himself, Russ.
How you
Ah,
doing?
throw
How
it
you
in.
doing this wonderful Monday, Tristan?
I'm doing, I think the word is the peachy keen. I think that's what they say these days. So it's a happy Monday, and we're happy to be here. And thank you for all who join in right as the show buzzer starts. But for those who are joining a little bit later, after, or somewhere in between that, let us reintroduce ourselves as Tristan Watty, who comes to you from the Professional Services Division of AWS, where we help to accelerate customers' journey to the cloud in a secure manner, fashion, and form. And Russ, where do you join us from?
I'm Russ. I'm joining from the Customer Incident Response Team. We help our customers um, contain, mitigate, and fully remediate from any security events that turn south and go into incident territory. So,
Yes. And you might notice a couple more dramatic pauses because it just seems to be that type of Monday to take that dramatic pause because this is a safe room featuring security side quest. But right, I just wanted to add that little title, and we're going to get like a cartoon version of this, just hinting to one of those old style cartoons. But
we
I
need an
digress.
intro with like
Yeah,
us being like, huh.
yeah, right. And we're just holding up different service icons.
Yeah. The
But
bad news is we're gonna scream for entire episodes at a time.
yes, exactly.
Security screening.
Yeah, and speaking of screaming, feel free to scream where you're dialing in from, where you're tuning in from, where you're listening from, where you're viewing, or anywhere else. So feel free to put that in the chat. We always like to see everybody join in to have the fun. As always, hello to the producer, Jeff. Make sure to put your questions in the chat because we will answer in the best way we know how. And hello to Ari as well. So, Dramatic Pause Monday is definitely one of those things that we are going to get some shirts for. And as always, we always like to have a secondary question. If you don't feel like answering to where you're from because you're the security mindset, fashion, or form, we have this. So, if you would like to be in a fictional universe, but you can only stay there for one day, but you also have the choice of living permanently in one fictional universe, what would your choice be? So, this is an interesting place to go. So, I toss this over to Russ. Where do you start?
So I feel like I would go with the safe answer on this one because of who I am, and I would permanently live in just one fictional universe. It would have to be something like, like Animal Crossing or Stardew Valley or something where I know that I'm not going to get brutally murdered as soon as I walk in there.
Yeah. Or you realize
Maybe
you're not
not
the
go
main
into the
character.
Doom universe with like the demons attacking or something like that. Like,
Yeah.
keep it chill.
Yeah. I think that's a good thing. You kind of learn the one universe that you're in. And speaking of learning, I also like to say hi, Borg. Thanks for joining today. I see. This is the interesting thing because if I can live in one, no, I would put a different one, right? And the reason why I go with this is because I'm the type, if I get stuck in one and you realize, like, hey, I have no powers in this universe or something like that, then you're stuck there, right? You're
Exactly.
the bread market person, right? That sells the bread to the main character or something along those lines. So
Yeah, it would be especially embarrassing if you choose a galaxy far, far away and then find out that your midichlorian count is 0.
yeah. So it's like
So
I can never be a Jedi, but everybody else, oh. Yeah, little things like that. But you can be a Jedi today because today's show is on an interesting topic because it's a continuation of something we spoke about. I believe that Russ is going to inform you about right this second. So, Russ, where are we coming from?
yes, last week we went over our AWS AVA episode. That's our fast travel disabled until identity verified. But this week we're going to follow up the AVA with our AWS Verified Access by building an advanced zero trust infinity castle, which I think is probably one of the coolest sounding titles we've had, but for sure.
Yeah, I think so. It fits the theme. 10 billion points to you if you get the reference as dead in the center of our title today. But I think it kind of sets us up, right? Because we start out with, hey, what is AWS Verified Access? Kind of getting some of the fundamentals, talking a little bit about zero trust. But now we're taking it one step further beyond to kind of understanding, how do we have some advanced visibility into zero trust, right? What is the transparent world that we cannot see when it comes to this, right? So when you think of continuously monitoring a comprehensive remote structure, what does that look like with zero trust? How do you have things like your SIM integrate? How do you have real-time traffic analysis? Those are the questions that you start to, kind of bounce around in your head. Because one of the things that you start to realize is when you have users and variables that are coming from different areas that need to access sensitive pieces of information, we're shifting our mindset, not only left, but into a different paradigm of how people remotely access environments. So there's a shifting room of security where you have this need to continuously reassess permissions. So if person A goes to coffee shop and they log in and they go up to the counter to get their coffee, well, how long do they have access before, they're timed out? Maybe they went to get coffee at the register 4 hours or 5 hours, right? Maybe they need to switch applications. So all these aspects come into play. I've often seen where somebody say, hey, can you watch my stuff while I go to the bathroom? And me as a security person is like, no, don't do that. I am not. But those kind of things start to come into play, as well as trying to figure out, hey, what is the correct authenticating method? It's one of those items where you can talk about different techniques. If we were to relate it to our theme today, what is the breathing technique that you use for advanced authentication patterns, especially using AVA or AVA? We're still continuing with the two pronunciations because we heard it both ways. And then how do we get to our completed zero trust implementation, right? How do we build up our Infinity Castle's defense? Right? What is the technical pieces to that? What do we have to consider? Well, I think one of the things to consider is, where do we start? We spoke about techniques. We spoke about zero trust and AVA in the past. I think where we start is, where are you? So I think to start this, let's ask this question. So if you were using a security breathing technique, which one would it be? Would it be a network flow breathing, identity stance, policy form, or total concentration, zero trust? Russ, where are you going?
I would probably go with identity stance. I think authentication is extremely important for being able to, control who is and is not able to access whatever, resources or critical infrastructure or whatever. I think that I think total concentration zero trust is aptly named because it does require a lot of concentration, and I feel like once that concentration is broken, that's when you start to, I guess, not introduce vulnerability, but that's when you start to, if you're relying on that zero trust, I think that once you get past that, it's kind of like, if you don't have defense in depth, then you're relying too heavily on zero trust because it is such an excellent model. That's when things can get a little spicy. But I like identity as far as like a secret breathing technique.
Yeah, and I think that's a good place to start because we often speak about least privilege, least privilege, least privilege. We say it 3 times for the people on the other side of the interwebs because, identity is a big part, right? So,
and also they can't see our foot stomping, so we gotta
exactly, right?
Say it multiple times.
2026 is going to be visualizations or audio cues, right? Just
Yeah.
our freestyle thing. But I think you're right, and you nailed it with total concentration is exactly that. And it's not just the individual or the infosec team or the identity team. This is everybody concentrating and aligning all at once. So when you start to think about, hey, how do I implement this at scale? Well, I have to have alignment from the app teams because, hey, my authentication has to go into something. My remote user has to go into something. And then they have to have the proper policies and procedures that are aligned with our governance strategy in place. And Ari also makes a good point. Would a company size change your answers? Would a smaller company be more interested in one option versus a large company? So I think that's a really good question, especially when you look at it from the perspective of a larger company would need total concentration for 4 because they have, we're assuming, multiple departments and verticals that they have to cater to. There's a wider approach with that, right? So I think that's a good point to point out. Where a smaller company might have one individual who is, hey, I'm the network person and I am in charge of trying to secure our AWS deployment because I'm the only one there, right? So those little things. What are your thoughts, Russ?
Yeah, I agree. Ideally, we would have, smaller companies, baking these sorts of things in from the beginning and then scaling them as they grow. But that's not realistic, and that's not what happens, because a lot of these security solutions or I mean, even just ingesting logs, is such a price dependent decision. So I think that this would definitely, I wouldn't even say necessarily smaller versus larger companies, but maybe smaller or larger or more mature security teams with maybe more resources set aside for security, bigger budgets, stuff like that. So I think that it would definitely come into consideration. I think your ability to have a high level of visibility within zero trust, using total concentration, would be extremely difficult and expensive, for a smaller company. So I think that would definitely be something that, they would want to consider, but would probably be priced out of, potentially. And so that's when you can start doing things like policy. Policy form is one of our secret breathing techniques, and we can do inline policies, SCPs, RCPs, so we could put them on the resources themselves, and also hopefully automating that so you can, make those changes at scale as you continue to grow and stuff like that. So yeah, that was a good question.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think that kind of brings us into understanding kind of your visibility. And I think that's part of it, because when you start to grow your maturity level, usually what comes along with that is different tool sets or a deeper dive into the tool sets. So now when you have this advanced authentication, you start to grab the analytics and visualizations, and you start to say, hey, how can we visualize this? Because now you're leveraging different tools to keep track of things. Like, for instance, you might have something like CloudWatch logs with some type of custom query pattern or something along those lines. Now you have to say, hey, we're ingesting all of these different pieces of information. I need to make it digestible to the stakeholders who are eventually going to say, why are we paying for this service and this service and this service, right? So you have to think of that overarching item. And usually the conversation starts to be, okay, what visibility do we have into it? Then the next piece of that is,
if you don't mind, if I could just hop in, I that's a great point. And I think I like to think of it as kind of like, like CI/CD, pipeline development. Once you launch your product, or in this case, purchase a license to a tooling, the job doesn't end there. You still have to operate and maintain it. right? The same thing with security. You have this infrastructure, just because you deploy some tools doesn't mean that's it, I'm done now.
Yeah.
There's still a lot to maintain and operate, especially as your business or whatever you're trying to protect grows. So will, your security team, your the things that you'll be covering, grows. You'll find out, hey, now that we're a larger company, more people on different platforms are looking to use our products. So now we're using Terraform and Kubernetes, and now you have to secure all these different new things. So that's what I like to think of it, is like, you don't appreciate when someone just drops a software application and then just hightails out of there, right? So
Yeah.
same thing with security. The organization itself is not, expecting, just to buy this solution and then be good. So there's a lot that goes, further into that. So
Exactly. And that's a good point as well, is because as companies grow, sometimes what they have is acquisitions or something along those lines, where they might be absorbing these other companies with their tool sets. Now you have to have the different tool sets speak to each other, right? Because sometimes it takes a while for the overlap to come through. So the optimization conversation starts to come into play. And part of that is when you start to get into the advanced log analysis, now you start looking at, okay, how can I do this natively in AWS? And how can I also do this with the third-party tools, right? Where you could essentially, if you need to do some type of on-spot or limited kind of view into some type of logs that are gathered, you can use like a Athena and Glue combo, right? Or you can leverage OpenSearch, right? So you can integrate that for log analysis as one of the components as well. So all of these items always talk about target state security, but I think it's part of the conversations because you want to be transparent in your monitoring your threat detection practices, especially when it comes from both sides. And what I mean by both sides is your C-level and then also your hands-on keyboard individuals, right? Because if the process is not understood of why it's important to filter or include some of these logs, then you leave yourself open to some potential gaps. And those gaps usually lead to something. And what is that? Usually a trip to talk to Russ, right? So,
yeah.
no.
but that's also why we highlight, integrating these security, every service that we go over or solution, we try to highlight, integrating that with your existing infrastructure. And that's why, because there are things like mergers and acquisitions or, going to a new tool that's cheaper or, has more AI in it or whatever reason. So, those things should be definitely a part of your security workflow. And so that's why it's so important that we discuss that.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why we're always big proponents of taking that step back, taking a look at the architecture and the services that you're leveraging. So you're always going to look at, okay, what are the core security services within AWS? And you start to say, are we leveraging that appropriately for our environment, right? If we have guard duty and we're talking about AVA, so are the findings correlating to the AVA events, right? Is it tuned to that level? And then do you have something like Security Hub absorbing that to figure out there's a connection? Do you have maybe custom CloudWatch metrics, right? To double check for the AWS Verified Access health. These are all questions that you start to ask yourself because essentially what you want is the clear visibility across your network boundaries. And this is something you're aiming towards. Why? Because one, you have some mechanisms to look at what traffic is coming in and out of your environment. But two, this is where the zero trust components come in a little bit more. Because now you have stuff like Transit Gateway and the flow logs that you have to analyze. You have cross-region access monitoring. You have CloudWatch dashboards because we were talking about the visibility aspects, right? So as you start to go into just the services you're leveraging AVA itself, you're also looking at network monitoring. So all these approaches kind of tie together to build up your advanced logging and traffic pattern analysis or something along those lines, right? Because as you mature, as we were speaking about within your environment, you want to make sure that you get to the point where, hey, I'm as close to an event as possible when it happens. Because if you start to go down the route, and we usually speak about this if I put on my TDIR hat, is you want to get into as close as you can to the original source and think about the entire workflow, right? So when a log is generated, how long for that log to generate till it gets to your responder, right? Is it 15 minutes, 20, 30? Because it goes through all these different hops, these different systems before there's some type of automation or eyes on it. Mm-hmm. And that starts to go down to, okay, how can we reduce that time, right? Because that's the dwell time overall of something happening within your environment. Because 5 minutes can be a long time depending on what it is. 5 minutes to spin up instances and run some type of mining operation or something along those lines. Yeah, that can be a costly endeavor. Right?
I was about to say 5 minutes. If you're talking about cost, it's a lot of time.
Yeah, right.
It's spend like a lot of money in 5 minutes.
Yeah, right. Because that could be it. Because the overall flow, and we have agreement. So when you start to go,
dogs with extremely strong opinions.
Yeah, see, this is the type of topic that gets everybody energetic. But I think part of the conversation needs to go to kind of how do you adapt, right? You have all these shifting rooms of security that happens, especially when you have AWO. So, Russ, what is kind of some of the dynamic pieces that we have to speak about?
Yeah, so when we talk about, dynamic access control, that's what we're looking to do is be able to provide access control in changing network environments, adapting to those changes. So, there's different ways that you can actually go through. I think that, just coming up with a couple of examples, like using Lambda functions and event bridge rules to automate policy updates. You can do that in response to network changes or to external changes. You can do things like implementing error handling or rollback mechanisms. You can create rules, or again, Lambda functions and event bridge rules, to do specifics such as, hey, there's a new VPC created. Let's, update the security policy, maybe to allow, other admins from the VPC creation to this new VPC creation, or restricting people from a new VPC creation until, it has the certain config attached to it. There's a lot of different things that you can kind of do to say, use like Lambda functions or event bridge, like using a rule that will meet certain criteria, and then using that sort of mechanism to be able to auto update based off of network environments or based off of network changes. And then, when I think of changing network environments, I also think of the systems manager. What is that? The parameter store that allows for configuration management, isn't that right?
Yeah, parameter store.
Yeah. And so there's things like that, or so you can, in parameter store, there's different like you could use version controlled security configurations, and actually have them be accessed across AWS accounts or regions, which I think is cool. I just learned that one, so I thought that one was useful. Yeah. So just bringing it up there. But you can also, also have parameter store automate the rotation of some sensitive configurations, or implementing IAM policies, such as least privilege access to those configuration parameters. Oof, these P words are going to be tough today. So yeah,
policy parameters.
Yeah. But yeah, so all of those things, can adapt to changes, that don't require a person to say, yes, there's a new VPC, add this, that, and the other thing. And then you can also make policy adjustments dynamically based on risk. So you can integrate with, say, I don't know, Amazon, like AWS Verified Access with Amazon Detective. Amazon Detective has risk scores. So you can put dynamic inputs to the AVA policy or AVA Verified Access. So that basically implements an automatic access restriction. So if suspicious activities are detected, Detective has a risk score. Say you put any risk above 5 on a scale of 10 or whatever, then you can have those restrictions put in place automatically, which is great because like Tristan was saying earlier, when we're looking at time from log to responder, you're taking in that time, and then you also have to investigate, shut things down, isolate, quarantine, and all those things, which as a person takes a really long time. But if you're doing it dynamically using like detective policy adjustments, you're automating that whole process. So from log creation or event time, this is happening within seconds or milliseconds, as opposed to minutes or hours with a human involved in the process. So these dynamic adjustments can seriously increase your ability to not just detect but also respond, which is, especially coming from my side of security, extremely important. So I really do think that that's super cool. Then you can do other things like creating custom risk scores to use that, and actually create maybe more in-depth automated response workflows. So yeah, there's lots of different things that you can do for that. You can even use real-time access control with Lambda. So like you can build Lambda authorizers that'll actually evaluate certain risk factors, such as like location, the device that you're using to try to access, historical access patterns. It could do all of those things before it grants access, giving you an extra level of security, being like, okay, is this actually the person that represents the user or role that's trying to authenticate, or is this someone outside of where the user is located normally? If you have someone in your office in London, and now all of a sudden there's Southern California IPs during what would be their nighttime, you're like, maybe Lambda will automatically reject this user because it's outside of their normal time and window. And maybe you go through and find out that is actually the user and they're at a conference this week. But being able to actually, ensure those things and reject the ability to authenticate based off of that, I think is super cool, and really does allow for a lot of different ways to increase your security posture.
Automation.
Yeah, exactly. But different ways that you can do it while still customizing, your criteria. In Detective, creating customer scores, or in Lambda using those authorizers, or even your own custom monitoring and alerting for those decision patterns, like those decision trees. You could do that as well. So there's just a lot that you can do to customize for your environment and really ensure that your actual use cases and your users' use patterns, very wildly differentiate between companies and stuff like that. So I think that's super cool to be able to very precisely make it consistent with your environment. And then there's real-time pattern analysis for access control. So using things like Amazon Kinesis data analytics for, you can detect different patterns based off of use or activity. I know that DynamoDB does access pattern for the storage. And then you can even you could actually show or configure CloudWatch anomaly detection and use that for different security metrics to identify unusual access patterns. So that way, say, for example, key security metrics. So maybe there's sensitive or critical data and you want to see how often, or even like a key in KMS, and see how often that key or critical data is accessed in your account. So you see, it's last year it was accessed 52 times, once a week, every week. And then all of a sudden you see an outlier outside of those 52 accesses. And then you go, okay, this is alerting and this seems outside of our routine. Time to start investigating. Or even having, different thresholds for different types of these patterns. You can actually create those automated response workflows based off of a CloudWatch anomaly detection, and using those anomaly alerts to be able to create, or not create, but trigger those automated response efforts.
So I think that's one of the points that I wanted to highlight really quick is sometimes when you're building your maturity level, sometimes you might not know, hey, this stands out, right, from the rest. So that depends on the maturity level of your organization, your security team, and everything in between, right? So I think part of the conversation also needs to be had with the different levels of the organization to set up, one, the foundational items, like Russ was saying. Hey, how are we going to automate partial items here via policies, via Lambda, via whatever the mechanism is? But I think all that needs to be defined. So I think to kind of hone in on some pieces of it, right? As we start to think about the past, we start to also get to the point where we might, one, hear a little bit of dramatic music start to play. And we might also get to the point where we think about some legends that we've heard in our cybersecurity careers, right? So that brings us to As SideQuest Legend Has It. So for you first time joining us, As SideQuest Legend Has It is that piece of our show where we dive into a customer story, a use case, something along those lines that we like to kind of highlight and bring out. Hey, what is the context? What was the challenge? What was the end result? So if we align that to what we were just speaking about, you may have questions. So what answers do we have? Well, the answer is in the form of the SideQuest board. So the SideQuest board is that visualization of everything we just mentioned to help us chat through. So let's throw out random global financial company powerhouse that, hey, they're using the traditional security perimeter. We spoke about something like this. But when it comes to advanced cloud threats, this is where they start to struggle a little bit because they have multi-regional infrastructure operated in, let's say, disconnected silos. And because of that, maybe they have something in EMEA, in the Americas, and everywhere in between that they're trying to allow secure remote access, but legacy VPN appliances maybe not the best setup for this type of organization within the cloud. So they needed to build, let's say, an advanced zero trust architecture. And the way we do that, well, we start to think of how do we scale, right? The dramatic pause again today. So in order to scale, let's say we have a scenario like this where we have our authenticated user up in the corner. Hey, I'm just trying to get to work. I'm trying to work on my sensitive application. So I'm building out the road over here. But parallel to that, we also have maybe somebody who's not authenticated, who's not the user you expect. So when you're on this scale level, I guess, Russ, from what you've seen, and feel free to also comment in chat, what is your greatest access security challenge, or what have you seen be the challenge with your customers?
So if I'm answering this based off of what I see, I would say probably policy sprawl, and just seeing that kind of get out of control, especially not to get into specifics, but I've seen organizations that have maybe say like a high number of IAM users that are all using access keys, and some of those are users and some of those are workflows, and they had trouble in the beginning with putting the appropriate permissions with the appropriate users, and then it kind of just gets crazy, and now you're trying to tag say 600 users, with some are workflows and some are users and some probably haven't been accessed for the last 3 years. So I think that policy is an issue. But if we're talking about this company specifically, a global financial powerhouse, I have to throw up regulatory maze as an option. Just seeing how tightly controlled some of these financial institutions are with their compliances is really does introduce a lot of challenges for any organization, really.
Yeah, and they have to adhere to it. You have the different standards. You have PCI, you have SOC, you have maybe it's high trust, depending on the scope of the financial piece, right? They might have different entities that we mentioned that may have to adhere to different items.
Healthcare as well.
Yeah,
not just financial. Any heavily regulated industry is definitely going to be see that, and there are so many, which is why I do think it is a problem. Or not a problem, a challenge.
Yeah, and that's kind of the thing, because if we continue on our quest, what we've seen here is exactly what Russ pointed out. We have our authenticated user, and there's an identity check. What we were speaking about with verified access is you start to get into the policy, you start to get into posturing. All those items are happening right here, right? And ideally, what we want is our unauthenticated users. Hey, there's a firewall here, and you are getting dropped. What does that drop mean? Hey, you get a big X, right? We'll put that right in between you and trying to get authenticated to our environment. That's just one of the mechanisms that you can take, right? The good old, denied. So when you start to go down this route, now you start to see, okay, what other challenges have we spoken about? Well, we have multi-region authentication flows. We have cross-account. We have dynamic policy management, global latency, right? Because everybody's coming from different areas. And when you have everything working, okay, that's great. We might have one item working. What happens when there's a failover? What is your failover strategy? In this organization, if they're using a traditional approach, their failover strategy might be 1, costly, or 2, non-existent to the extent that they would like it to be. So when your access level changes, your global access level changes. And what we mean by that is, hey, when you're working on a global scale, depending on the maturity of your environment, you may say, hey, I have identity in here. Well, that's just one of the aspects that you can have. But the other aspect is, hey, how are users who are leveraging your infrastructure accessing the environment? Are they going through the console, or are they managing your CI/CD, or are they the developer, right? All these items start to kind of compound, let's say. And if we're thinking about building out our Infinity Defense architecture, because this is our Infinity Castle, right? We're going beyond. Now we start to think of, okay, I have this that eventually goes here, but what other mechanisms should we have? Well, there's different mechanisms within AWS, especially organizations. You have SCPs, you have your multi-account approach, right? Stuff that you can go through the security reference architecture and kind of dive into, but I digress. One of the pieces that you can go to is, hey, Russ spoke about this, is the adaptive control portion. So you know what? We'll add it right here because that's a big part of the puzzle. So if we are trying to adapt to the different policies that are happening and occurring within our environment, now in order to, let's say, gain access, we have our policies. And then these policies can adapt based on, hey, what we set it up to be. And what do we set it up to be? Well, that kind of is based on your target state security strat. We say it 3 times all the time for the people on the other side of the interwebs. But I think what we start to also see is customers trying to adapt really fast and trying to drive at 100 miles an hour because, hey, they have deadlines. Hey, we have to get this up by this time. We have to get this POC in by this time. And usually, one of the things is just getting them access to the environment. But leveraging something like Ava, you can do that. Why? Because of all the different checks. Because remember, zero trust is no trust. You got to verify. Every door, if you're going back to our house analogy from last week, your traditional perimeter is, think of the gate fence that people have to kind of open and come in, or your front door of your house. But after you have that open, they can kind of go around your house and kind of, eat your food, sleep in your bedroom, whatever they want to, because they have that initial level of access. But zero trust, every door, or I would say step, or anything in between that, they would have to authenticate and prove who they are. Do that a couple of times.
Yeah.
So
that's where the analogy starts to break down, because if every single door and every single room is locked up in someone's house, like, what are you hiding? But
what do you know?
When you
what do you know, Russ?
I was gonna say, but when you have the background that Tristan does, you need some security.
Yeah, and that's the funny part, because often the conversation is, hey, I don't want to burden my users. How can I do this in a balanced approach? Well, leveraging the correct policy can be kind of a little bit in the background to the users, because device posturing, right? Before you can get onto our network, your device has to be up to date, right? And that's something that can be relatively transparent if the user reboots the computer every, so once in a while. Some people are guilty, maybe not rebooting, every year. So
I was gonna say, are you one of those people?
So I plead the fifth on that. And as we start to go forward, what we also start to ask is this journey complete? And I think the simple answer is no. The second simple answer is it's complicated. And the third piece is we have to pause the game to say why it is that the case, right? So Zach Moore's timeout on that piece. So I think the conversation we have to have is, what are the techniques that companies and customers are using in order to leverage something like zero trust with Ava in order to better understand their environment, 1, and 2, how to manage that. So if we were having the breathing technique of authentication, I think part of it is, how does everything get integrated? Right? So if you're thinking about the authentication methods, now you start to think maybe SAML. Okay, if I have SAML integration, because a lot of customers, what we see is authentication with multiple providers, maybe you have something like Identity Center. Now you have Identity Center with Ava, and it has certain things that you have to consider, like attribute mapping, session duration, or role-based access. All these items are different techniques that you can start to leverage, because if you have an OIDC provider, now you can configure that with Ava, right? There's different methods to acknowledge, and you're combining essentially with that defense in depth approach that we were speaking about, kind of the way forward, the path forward, with multi-factor authentication in there. I always like to say that because MFA is important. I think one of the steps, one of the techniques is ensuring that not only is your Ava implementation sound, but you want to make sure your certificate process is also sound. Because that's something that's often like, oh, we'll figure it out. Or it comes after, it's not it's an immediate thought, right? And then it's like, all right, we need a certificate on this to do this. And let's rush it and we're not thinking about it. And that's a big part of the puzzle, right? Because if you want to start to get down the line of, hey, how do we have certificate management and lifecycle automation with that certificate? How do we revoke that certificate? How do we integrate the trust policies with AVA on it? All these factors are considerations that we have to have. So I like to think as we go down this route, okay, that's one method, but we have to have multiple methods. And today's day and age, biometric authentication, right? What are the integration patterns for that? Well, it depends on the organization and how they're leveraging. Are they using company devices? Are they using a third-party service? Or are they using the proper attestation that goes with it? So all these pieces of the puzzle that you have to think, and you kind of start to see where a pipeline forms. Some, I wouldn't say step up authentication workflow, something along those lines, but these are all pieces of the puzzle that you have to consider. I think the other piece of that is starting to understand that workflow. How do we monitor it? I think that's a key consideration. So what we're going to do is turn this right back onto the audience. How do you exactly monitor? What is your monitoring technique? What are you using? Are you using, the transparent world with Amazon CloudWatch? Are you using see-through vision with GuardDuty? Total concentration login with OpenSearch? Or the all-seeing eye of AWS Security Hub? All these different items. Feel free to put 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the chat based on what your preferences. But while you do that, parallel to that, Russ, what is your monitoring technique passed down to you?
Unfortunately, due to what I do and how often I see, I'm generally my support goes to the less mature security teams, and so I'm kind of usually pigeonholed into one with just CloudWatch and management events. But ideally, I would like to see total concentration logging, and have, using OpenSearch to be able to, increase your visibility with logs and having a, let's say a nice easy platform for doing all of that, for ingesting and querying as well. So yeah, I'd like to see, but usually it's one, and it's usually not cloud. Like Cloud Trails, it's usually, Cloud Trail event history, which I just,
yeah. And it's interesting because my heart also kind of goes out to the CloudWatch, but also I want to say, hey, when we start to design and build, I like to say, hey, is GuardDuty enabled? Or are the different features of GuardDuty enabled, right? Because when you're having these conversations with the customer, sometimes they, hey, we have another tool doing this. We want to be more of agnostic when it comes to what services we're leveraging. Well, that is completely fine, but what is capturing? And GuardDuty is usually a good starting point for the different organizations. So you want to kind of have that see-through vision from my perspective. Eventually get into the all-seeing eye because that's where everything's going to end up. But at least if you're using and leveraging something like a GuardDuty, now you can take those logs, those findings, integrate it with whatever you want and go from there. So little things to think about as you start to build out your monitoring vision. But I think
that is a good point, though, because you do bring up for logging, sometimes you just have to get your basics down, even if it's not perfect, especially in the beginning. Getting a level of visibility is better than, don't let good be the enemy of perfect, or whatever that phrase is.
Yeah.
Don't stretch for perfection that you're missing out on good solutions, like GuardDuty or something, until you have an ingestion mechanism that might be better for all your logs.
Yeah, exactly, because what we usually talk about is that end-to-end workflow, right? So if you say, hey, I have this SIM, It's not AWS. It's a third-party tool. It's one of the AWS partners that we're using. Okay, great. You have something, but are your logs getting to that? Are your logs getting to that in some type of priority order, right? Are you shipping all your logs? Because I've seen solutions where, hey, I have these items generated and I want to ship this outside to another cloud provider. Okay, great. It may be costly, but one of the things that you want to consider is the optimization of that. It's like, oh, do you break up the criticals and highs to handle a certain way versus the mediums and lows? And that all goes down to your governance strategy or organization posture, things of that nature. But if you're trying to get towards that final form of your Infinity Castle defense, you want to get to a point where you have the zero trust implementation using something like an AVA, where you have the verified access environment, right? So if we start to think of that, Russ, what have you seen work when it comes to getting to that final form?
Yeah, so I think the final form is kind of definitely going to vary with each organization, what your process is, what you're looking to do. So I think that there's a couple of steps that we'd want to take for, what we here at the Safe Room might consider the ultimate defensive infrastructure. I think that there's some key, let's say, pairings, or maybe just a couple of things that I think would go into this. So, for example, I think AVA integration with network firewall, and when I say, I think this sort of zero trust implementation for AVA, it's really Tristan. I'm basically just repackaging your words here. But for real, but with AVA integration with network firewall, adding on the Shield Advanced protection, but also using custom rule sets within your WAF, and even adding the control tower guardrails, kind of brings all of those different services together to really create an extremely difficult to gain authentication architecture. This is kind of where I'd see a defensive architecture like this. A lot of attackers might be like, okay, this is actually pretty well done. This doesn't seem like it's worth the time investment to really get into this environment. Let's go for another low-hanging fruit customer that, will have Russ come kick us out eventually. So between that, I think that would be like, our defensive architecture, kind of more perimeter security-ish, if you will. And then adding in, so I'd say we start with the defensive perimeter architecture, and then adding in layered security controls. This is when you're going to look at your security groups and your network ACL configurations, and you're going to want to design your security groups and your NACLs that work in concert with AVA, to be able to provide that defense in depth, and hopefully not create access conflicts or even performance bottlenecks with that. And then in implementing things like automated security groups, adding some of that dynamic access control in a security group policy setting, and then also just monitoring and measuring of your security groups and your NACL, both their changes and performance, to be able to kind of use those patterns to be able to establish other things like IAM permission boundary implementations, using the data that you have access to be able to tighten up and I think, I don't know if this is an AWS thing, but like iterating and making things better, is definitely something that I constantly hear, and so I think that's something that'll allow you to do that. And then, like normal, we're running out of time, so I'm going to try to run through these a little bit quickly. But then also integrating as much of your security components as you can. So this is when we start deploying maybe organization-wide SCPs while enabling AVA, so that way it works across account boundaries, creating like hierarchical SCP structures. That way you can accommodate different security requirements based off of app or resource or whatever your environment's looking for. And then, using IAM Identity Center, the permission sets and how you structure that, creating granular permission sets, being able to enforce, least privilege and zero trust privileges or principles. And then designing permission sets with inheritance and management structures, which allows you to automate those permission sets and have that dynamic access control. And then, of course, we're going to continuously validate and improve this as we go, because you don't want to just leave a security solution, drop an app, and just walk away. We also have to validate and improve, walk through, Security Hub, maybe design custom Security Hub controls. The Security Hub controls can continuously validate your configurations and policies. They can also alert on deviations from that. And then also, of course, compliance reporting for security controls, which is, for me, someone who does not work with a lot of compliance, is the best part of Security Hub. And then, of course, develop, a well-architected security review mechanism. So whether that's, reviewing AVA implementations against a security pillar, I could see Tristan feeling hell yeah, being represented by well-architected.
Yeah. Well, every time you say something, I'm like, and that's certificate knowledge. So the more you know, right?
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
And so I think at this time we're just gonna have to run through our resources here
in our knowledge quest, right? Of course, and I think part of it is we usually do the speed run towards the end of the show of like, here, these are a couple of items that you want to focus on. But I think the important part is if we were trying to gather our knowledge, trying to kind of maybe build Aura or something in between that, maybe we're trying to take part in our journey of remote authentication. We want to get to a point where we start. And the best way to start that is, hey, start with like an architecture, right? And the way you start with our architecture is, okay, what are we trying to achieve? If we're using AWS Verified Access, now we're starting to get to a point where we want to essentially say, hey, I have an internet connection and I'm trying to get access to whatever the piece may be, right? So if a user accesses enterprise application via the internet, WAF picks up, AVA verifies, and then forwards the traffic, and then everybody, success, cheers, and you hear the crowd go wild, right? So applause, right? You authenticate securely.
And then everyone claps.
Is this exact thing. There's an architecture of how this exact workflow works out, right? So with that workflow, we're starting to get to a point where, hey, we understand AVA, we understand some of the knowledge, and we kind of skip some of the levels that we were talking about originally within the show, where you have your 100, 200, you go right to 300, because now I understand that knowing is half of what we need to know. And the other half of that is usually said by Russ.
Create an incident response plan.
Yes, right? So all those things in between. And feel free to reach out to us and let us know that you created an incident response plan, you have secure remote authentication, and you want to tune in again every Monday, 2 p.m. Eastern, 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, to the Safe Room featuring Security Side Quest. Until next time, then, have a good one. Happy Monday, and take care.